So, if you're deep in the Next.js world, you know that caching just got a major overhaul. It's time to kind of forget everything you knew about those old route-level configs. Today, we are going to break down the new cache components model and give you a simple, powerful guide to really get the hang of it.
We've all been there, right? You're stuck with this fundamental trade-off. Do you serve up a page in a blink of an eye, but risk the data being a little stale? Or do you go fetch the absolute latest, up to the second data, but make your user stare at a loading spinner? It's that classic tug of war, speed versus freshness.
I mean, look at the extremes. On one side, you've got fully static pages. They are blazing fast because they're already built, but they can't show anything personalized or in real time. Then on the other side, you have fully dynamic pages. They're always fresh, but they have to be built from scratch for every single person who visits, which can make that initial load feel, well, pretty sluggish.
Okay, so here's our game plan. First, we're going to really nail down that core static versus dynamic problem. Then, we'll dive into the really elegant solution, partial pre-rendering. After that, we'll get our hands dirty with the new toolkit, completely rewire our mental model for caching, and finally, we'll master the advanced controls you'll actually need for your production apps.
So, how do we escape this dilemma? How do we get the best of both worlds? The answer is this really powerful concept in Next.js called Partial Prerendering, or PPR for short. And its entire reason for being is to give you that instant speed of a static site with the real-time freshness of a dynamic one. So here's how it works. At its core, PPR immediately sends a static shell of your page to the user. This shell has all the stuff that doesn't change, giving the user something to see and interact with right away. Then, the dynamic pieces are streamed in to fill in the gaps. Just picture an e-commerce page in your head. The main navigation, the footer, the product description, that's all your static shell. It loads instantly. But the little shopping cart icon that shows your specific item count or the product recommendations based on your browsing history, those are the dynamic holes, and they get streamed in just a split second later.
So the process is pretty simple. First, the user gets that instant static shell. Second, any of those dynamic spots show a little fallback, like a loading spinner or one of those cool skeleton UIs. And third, as soon as the dynamic data is ready, it streams in and just replaces those fallbacks. For the user, it feels seamless and incredibly fast.
All right, that sounds great in theory, but how do we actually do this? How do we build it? Well, our new toolkit basically has two main tools: React's built-in suspense, and a brand new Next.js directive called useCache.
Now, suspense has been around for a bit, but its role here is absolutely critical. Think of it as the magic boundary between your static shell and your dynamic content. You just wrap a dynamic component in suspense, and you're basically telling React, hey, while this piece is off fetching its data, just show this loading state instead, okay?
So when do you need to reach for it? Well, pretty much any time you're accessing runtime info that's specific to one user's request, things like cookies, headers, or search params. Or, of course, when you're fetching dynamic data from an API or a database. These kinds of components must be wrapped in a suspense boundary so they don't block that initial static shell from rendering.
Okay, let's look at a classic trap. Here we have a user component, and it's trying to access cookies. But notice, it's not wrapped in suspense. In the new model, this is a total blocker. It stops the static shell from being sent, which completely defeats the whole purpose of PPR.
And the fix? It's honestly this simple. You just wrap that dynamic user component in a suspense boundary, give it a nice fallback like this avatar skeleton, and boom, problem solved. Now the page loads instantly with the skeleton, and the real user info streams in right after.
Okay, so that's suspense. The second tool is useCache. Now, if suspense is all about creating the dynamic holes, useCache does the exact opposite. It lets you take something that would normally be dynamic, like a query to your database, and tell Next.js, hey, you know what, go ahead and cache this. I want it to be part of the static shell.
And using it could not be easier. You literally just add the string useCache to the very top of a server component or, like you see here, a data fetching function. And just like that, this getProducts function will now run at build time and its result becomes part of the static pre-render.
All right, this is a big one, so let's pause for a second, especially if you're a seasoned Next.js dev. To really use this new model right, you have to fundamentally change how you think about rendering and caching. Let's break down that mental shift.
Let's really look at this shift. Before, Next.js was static by default. It tried to cache everything unless you told it not to. Now, it's dynamic by default. Everything is rendered on demand unless you explicitly opt into caching with useCache.
Control has gone from the whole route down to individual components and functions, and the caching now covers all server I/O, not just your fetch requests.
So what does that mean for your old code? Well, remember, export const dynamic equals force static that you used to put in your route config. Now you just pop use cache right inside the page component itself. And that old export const revalidate, that's now handled by a new cache life function, which keeps the logic right next to the data it's actually controlling. It's much cleaner.
Okay, so we know how to cache things, but in the real world, data is always changing. So how do we invalidate the cache when we need to show fresh data? Let's get into some of the more advanced controls.
The new flow is a really simple two-step process. First, when you cache something, you give it a tag, like say cart or posts. Then, whenever that data changes, maybe in a server action, you just invalidate that specific tag. This gives you super precise control over exactly what gets refreshed and when.
For data that needs to update immediately within the very same request, you're going to use update tag. The perfect example is updating a shopping cart. A user adds an item, you call update tag cart in your server action, and the cart data is instantly refreshed just for them. No waiting.
Now, for content that isn't specific to one user and can handle a tiny delay, you'll use revalidate tag. Think about publishing a new blog post. You call revalidate tag posts. This tells Next.js, hey, invalidate the cache for this tag, so the next person who visits gets the fresh version. It's perfect for things that need to be eventually consistent.
So after all of this, after learning this whole powerful new system, what does it take to actually turn it on? You are gonna love this. It is one single line in your next.config.js file. Cache components true. That's it. You've just unlocked this entire model for your app.
If you only remember one thing from all of this, let it be this right here. This is the new philosophy. Everything is dynamic by default. You, the developer, then strategically add use cache to the pieces that will actually benefit from being static. The control has completely shifted from the framework to you.
And that leaves us with a final question to think about. Now that you have this incredible fine-grained control, take a look at your own apps. What's the first dynamic component, that first data fetch, that you could wrap with use cache and make your users experience just that little bit faster?